Lane New Press Book, welcome to RTB 2021 for November the 19th, 2021. Hope you're doing well today. So our text for today, we have 1 Chronicles 13 and 14, continuing with our kind of survey of the life of David in 1 Chronicles. Then we have James 1, entering into the book of James once again, even as we did earlier this year. And then we have Amos 8. And then finally, we have Luke chapter 3. So why don't we start over with... Well, we can start with James. So again, we've been in James before. James, the author of James here is probably the brother of Jesus, leader in the early church. We read about him in the book of Acts, in Acts 12 and Acts 15. One of the leaders at the Jerusalem Council that we find in the book of Acts, and one of the leaders of that Jerusalem church. This is a book that was probably written early, maybe even the earliest New Testament letter that we have here, although there are some who say it was written a little bit later. Of course, James was ultimately martyred as an early church leader. It's also one of the more controversial books in the New Testament. There are those who did not like this book, including famously Martin Luther, who infamously called this an epistle of straw, mainly because he believed it disagreed with Paul on justification. But as we'll see tomorrow, when we look at James chapter 2, I think that it comports quite well with Paul's teaching. But even Luther didn't exclude it from the canon. He just probably didn't teach it from it that often. But it's a very practical letter. It's of course, James would have been steeped in Old Testament wisdom, the Old Testament works, and so it mirrors a lot of Old Testament literature, but particularly the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So it's very practical in that sense, and so it emphasizes a lot of things that wisdom literature does. In fact, it even begins with verse 5 saying, "If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him." So this is a prayer request that God will always answer, that we will be given wisdom. And again, how would James conceive of wisdom, and how do we conceive of wisdom? Well, we conceive of wisdom, biblically speaking, as something grounded in the fear of the Lord. And so if this is grounded in the fear of the Lord and knowledge of God, it's something that God himself can give and reveal to us. He also stresses, for instance, the dangers of the tongue, even as the wisdom literature of the Old Testament does in the book of Proverbs, for instance. And so, for instance, in verse 26 of chapter 1, if anyone thinks himself religious, yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. And so probably the lead theme of the book of James is this idea of faith as being something that really does work itself out. And this is in how we speak and how we treat those who are the poor among us, those who it reveals itself in how we engage see ourselves. Do we see ourselves with humility and these types of things? Let's see, anything else? And probably the most famous verse of this first chapter is verse 22. But prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. So that is kind of that theme of the book of James. It's a theme of faith working itself out. So that's James. Let's move over to, let's see, we'll go over to Luke while we're in the New Testament. Luke chapter 3. Well, again, we've been in Luke 3 before. And in Luke 3, we are seeing the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry, but we're also, so we've kind of covered in Luke 1 and 2 the early life of Jesus, the birth and of course his visit to Jerusalem. And then we have John the Baptist starting his ministry, paving the way, even as Samuel paved the way for David. John the Baptist is paving the way for Jesus. And really the focus of this, of course, remember the purpose of Luke, as is all the Gospels, is proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ and encourage belief in him. And so they are evangelists. We even call the gospel writers the evangelists. And so they're going to be focused on and rightly so, on the identity of Jesus. And here in Luke, at the end of Luke 3, we have two stories, actually a story and a genealogy. And then at the beginning of Luke 4, we have another story, a narrative, that all three of these combine to tell us something very key about the identity of Jesus. And in each case, it actually identifies Jesus as the Son of God. Now, in an Old Testament understanding of that idea. Now, in the Old Testament, there are three entities that are known, that are called in a figurative sense, the Son of God. You have, of course, Israel itself, that is referred to at times as God's son. You have the king in the line of David, that is figuratively referred to as God's son. This is where we get the messianic idea. And then we have, of course, Adam as kind of a son of God, right? And in each of these instances, in these three, the baptism of Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus, and the temptation of Jesus, each of these stories shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of all those things, whether it's Israel, David, or Adam. He is the new Israel, he's the new David, he's the new Adam. Well, how's that accomplished? Well, look at the baptism. The baptism, I think the most significant thing about the baptism is the identity of Jesus that's proclaimed by God himself. He says, of course, famously, "You are my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." This phrase, "you're my beloved son," goes all the way back, of course, to 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant, where God calls David his son. And sonship becomes synonymous with Davidic kingship. And so when he says, "You are my son in whom I'm well pleased," he's saying, you are that Davidic king. And by the way, that phrase, "in whom I'm well pleased," is pointing to Isaiah 42, which is one of the servant songs in Isaiah. And so this is a statement, an identity that proclaims Jesus as not just a Davidic king, but the one who would suffer on behalf of his people. But Luke's point that I think he's making is larger than that, and that is that Jesus is that true Son of God, the king in the line of David. What about the genealogy? Well, the genealogy, unlike Matthew's genealogy, which goes back to Abraham, you see that Luke's genealogy goes back to Adam. Why does Luke's genealogy go back to Adam? Well, one reason is because Luke is writing to Gentile believers. And so he's establishing Jesus as the Messiah, not just to the Jews, those who descend from Abraham, but to all those who descend from Adam. But also, I think he's showing that Jesus is that true Son of God, the new Adam, the one who would fulfill the role that Adam was supposed to play. And that is to be the true image of God, right? And then when we get to Luke 4, and we read that story of the temptation of Jesus, and we will talk maybe a little bit about this more tomorrow, but you look at the three ways in which Jesus is tempted. He goes into the wilderness, just as Israel went into the wilderness after the Exodus. He's tempted in the same way Israel was in the wilderness. Man shall not live, he's tempted by the lack of food. Man shall not live by bread alone. He's tempted by the devil saying to him, "I'll give you all this if you only bow down to him." So he's tempted by idolatry. He's tempted by taking God's provision and protection for granted. And in each of those ways, Israel was also tempted in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus and Numbers. And in each case, Israel failed, right? But in this case, Jesus succeeds in each case by quoting from Deuteronomy, by the way, by basing his life in response on God's word, on God's covenant document, even as Israel did not do this. And in so doing, he shows himself to be the true Israel, the true Son of God. So Jesus is the true Son of God. He is the new Israel. He's the new David. He's the new Adam. And this is, of course, what Luke is, I think, trying to accomplish with each of these identifications. Moving on to, let's go over to, speaking of David, let's go over to Chronicles. So we're in the Chronicles 13 through 14. So here in this passage, you find David bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. This is a key event, both in Samuel and in Chronicles. It's it's almost parallel, completely parallel to the account that we find in 2 Samuel 6. And the point of the author is to show once again the importance of restoring worship, God being among his people, and and God's stamp of approval upon his king, upon David. And then when we get to chapter 14, we see this emphasis on David once again. We see David almost being presented in this, again, in this ideal way where God is blessing him, and with all these different things, whether that's friendship and provisions from foreign nations that we read about in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 14. We see the fruitful lineage of David in verses 3 through 7. We see David's victory in battle in the rest of the chapter. And it's providing a further contrast with David and Saul, but really what it's doing is it's showing David as this ideal king who has God's blessing upon him, who has God's presence with him in the form of this Ark of the Covenant. And again, the overall purpose of that, to show David in this ideal way, is to communicate to that post-exilic audience that their hope is in a ideal Davidic king. And guess what? So is ours. Our hope is in an ideal Davidic king, and that is in the person of Jesus Christ. That brings us finally to the book of Amos, chapter 8, Amos 8. So in Amos 8, we have, now if you remember, let's see if I can remember what we talked. Yeah. So remember in chapter 7, we had those 5 visions starting in chapter 7 of Yahweh. We had first of all, that vision of locust in chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. Then we had the vision of the great fire devouring the land, which could have been a drought or famine or something like that. And then at the end of chapter 7, or not at the end of chapter 7, but chapter 7, verses 7 through 9, we had the vision of that plumb line. The first 2 cases, Amos pleads and the people are delivered. The third case, Amos doesn't plead at all. There's no note of whether they're delivered or not, but there's no pleading going on there. Then we get to chapter 8, and then we have this vision of a basket of rotten fruit, of summer fruit. And God asks Amos, what do you see? And he says, a basket of summer fruit. And the Lord said, the end has come for my people. I will spare them no longer. Notice that Amos doesn't plead for his people anymore. And God is not going to spare anymore either. They have turned rotten, is the picture that is communicated here. And then we see that judgment coming in the form of this day of the Lord vision that he has towards the end of this chapter. And he mentions this idea of the day of the Lord. Days are coming, declares the Lord. And he'll bring things like famine and these other covenant curses upon the people. And again, what this symbolizes is what the day of the Lord really is. It's a day of covenant enforcement. In this case, a day of covenant enforcement on that northern kingdom for their covenant disobedience. And it's going to come in the form of, ultimately, of an exile some 40 years after Amos prophesies, the exile of the northern kingdom at the hands of the Assyrian Empire. So kind of a dour note to end on today. But that's Amos, and we've got one more chapter in Amos, and we'll be done with Amos. But Amos is a neat book in many ways, I think. It's a little bit dreary, but the imagery that he uses and the way in which you can see how you have this covenant basis of the message of Amos is very clear in this book. So that's our text for today, I think, on this day, November 19th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.